Welcome to science class. Today we are going to learn about agriculture. Now, why would we study agriculture in an earth science class? That sounds like a topic for a history class. Well, to be honest, this video is a history lesson, with some science sprinkled in. The reasons why science is important are historical, and as I said in the video on soil, agriculture is perhaps the one human activity that has the greatest impact on the planet and reveals the different ways in which we are part of and influence the biosphere, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and the geosphere. Food is also what has allowed the world's population to explode from 1.65 billion 100 years ago to over 7.5 billion today. That's a massive change. So, how did it happen? That will be the first thing we cover today. What agriculture is and what the agricultural revolution was. I argue that there have been 3 agricultural revolutions. The first one occurring all around the world thousands of years ago, and the second and third revolutions both occurring in the 20th century. I also feel that a 4th agricultural revolution is coming in the near future for 2 reasons. One is, as technology changes, we change the way we do things. We are in the beginning of the electrification of the transportation sector, for example. And I think a shift in agricultural practice is coming. I also think a 4th agricultural revolution will occur out of necessity. Agriculture as it is currently practiced cannot feed 15 billion people, but there will almost certainly be that many of us one day. So what will the future of agriculture look like? We will also discuss the kinds of problems we face because of agriculture. Let's get started. So, what is agriculture? It is defined as the science or practice of cultivation of the soil for the growing of crops and the rearing of animals to provide food, fibers, and other products. We will focus a lot more on crops than animals today. To do agriculture, you keep some of the seeds you harvest, you plant them systematically, you keep track of your animals if you're raising animals, you breed them systematically, and you feed them with some of the food you grow. This system has been carried out by Sumerians and Americans and Minecraft players for thousands of years. The alternative to agriculture is hunter-gathering, which you've probably heard of before. Ironically, settling down and inventing agriculture for a really long time was, well, one of the worst ideas we ever had. Were we really better off to give up foraging for food to sit down and grow food instead? In a lot of ways, no. Our diets became worse, a lot worse. Hunter-gatherers have wide-ranging diets, but most people who lived in agricultural societies only ate a few types of food because only a few types of food can be grown on large scales. The health and physique of those agriculturalists suffered as well. When pilgrims first came to the Americas, they were in awe of the indigenous people they came across. They were like giants. They were muscular, fit, tall, and they were thriving. The Europeans, by contrast, came from places in the world stricken by diseases like rickets, and where people ate an extremely limited diet. The indigenous Americans in that area were hunter-horticulturalists, which means they grew the crops they needed, but hunted for animals, and they didn't waste food they grew by feeding it to animals. Hunter-gatherers also had way more free time than people who settled down to do farming. Farming is back-breaking, unnatural work. For thousands of years, most people spent most of their waking days working on crops. The animals we have raised surely aren't doing any better. You might think that the fact that there are 24 billion chickens on the planet means they are thriving, but they and other livestock live some of the most miserable lives of any creatures on the planet. Dairy cows spend almost their entire lives pregnant because their bodies don't produce milk otherwise. Many calves that are born are kept in pens too small for them to move or stand to keep their muscles flaccid so they can be turned into veal. Chickens are crammed into wire cages with 2 or 3 other hens to do nothing but eat, poop, and lay eggs. Not to mention they're stupid. Domesticated animals have significantly smaller brains because we have bred them to be incapable of surviving on their own. It has been estimated that 10,000 years ago, Humans and their livestock represented less than 0.1% of the vertebrate land biomass. Today, we represent around 98% of it. That is perhaps the quickest and most dramatic ecological shift for land vertebrates in the history of our planet. Technology can send us backwards. The internet is great, but it is also responsible for a huge amount of crime and fake news. And agriculture arguably made us worse off until just the last 100 years, or perhaps a bit longer. But now, thanks to our terrible diets and health, we might be going backwards yet again. Now, I'm not trash talking agriculture. I'm just saying it took a long time for the cumulative effects to be true benefits. Writing, government, disease resistance, city-states, these things all came from cultures that settled down in large groups to grow food. But those cultures also invented slavery, forced most of their citizens into hard labor, ruled with absolute authority, utilized horrendous methods of torture and cruel punishment, used their armies to steal land from other people for no good reason, burned witches, and many other things. Eventually, though, we grew up. Science was invented from these cultures as well. Eventually, we figured out a system where only some of the population grows food and the rest are free to do what they want. We started inventing things and discovering things and writing new books on philosophy and human rights. We wouldn't be where we are today if agriculture hadn't happened. So as I said a while back, I argue that there have been 3 agricultural revolutions. Let's talk about them. The first revolution in agriculture was, well, the invention of it. This was a radical shift from the way we had been living on Earth for around 200,000 years. So why did it take so long to invent agriculture? I mean, think about it. 100 years ago, airplanes were death traps. Wireless communication didn't exist. The dictionary didn't contain the word plastic. The world has changed so much in the last 100 years. What if the agricultural revolution had happened 500 years earlier? What world would we live in? Flying cars? Moon resorts? Every book ever written downloaded straight into your brain from birth? If only they had gotten off their butts and started planting seeds a little bit earlier, right? Well, here's the thing. Agriculture was as much an accident as a discovery. Be thankful it happened when it did, because it easily could have taken 1,000 years longer if things had been slightly different. The vast majority of plants and animals are worthless for domestication. This is what native corn looks like. Now compare that to the modern day crop. You can't support a civilization of millions of people with the natural version. It is the same story with almost all crops and fruit. They are either tiny or full of seeds, or contain toxic compounds, or only grow in tiny climate regions, you name it. You see, us humans have a very species-centric way of looking at, well, everything. But plants didn't evolve so that humans could plant them all around the world. Thousands of years ago, the plant that became wheat only grew in a tiny region of the Mediterranean. Through nothing but dumb luck, we found it, altered it, and now it grows all around the world. Animals are even worse than plants. Here's a collage of common domesticated farm animals. Almost every one of these animals comes from Eurasia. The Americas had no cows, sheep, goats, horses, or pigs. Zebras in Africa were never domesticated. Neither were any of the other medium-sized animals except camels. They're just too dangerous. Bison, deer, and antelope in the Americas were never domesticated either, and they still haven't been today. Some have been tamed, but this is not domestication. But the Americas did have some of the best crops. Tomatoes, potatoes, corn, chilies, beans, these evolved in Central and South America. Imagine that. Nobody in Europe had ever eaten a tomato or a potato before Columbus. You think traditional Italian food and you think of dishes with tomatoes in them, but that tradition isn't very old. You probably learned in middle school that agriculture was invented in the Fertile Crescent, but it was independently invented multiple times. There are over half a dozen places around the world where people independently utilized agricultural techniques with the kind of food they had available to them. Agriculture gradually spread around the world, but it continued to be practiced in almost the exact same way up through the Industrial Revolution. If we were going to fundamentally change agriculture, we would have to start getting scientific, and that's eventually what happened. The second agricultural revolution can actually be pinpointed to an exact date. The domestication of crops and animals happened independently on dates that range for many thousands of years. But the next agricultural revolution occurred on July 2nd, 1909, at the University of Karlsruhe in Karlsruhe, Germany. It was here that two chemists, Fritz Haber and Robert Le Rossignol, invented the Haber-Bosch process, which created the first synthetic fertilizer. In the last video, I talked about how plants get their nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Nitrogen is the one element that is hardest to get. It's easy to get enough potassium and phosphorus and water, but there was never enough nitrogen to grow the amount of food we really needed. The Haber-Bosch process created liquid ammonia from the air. It was an absolute miracle of an invention. And make no mistake, these two men are mostly responsible for the existence of 6 billion people, because that is how much the world population has increased since their invention. We now grow 250% more food today than we did back then. Today's population numbers would have never happened without these two scientists. So that is what I consider the second agricultural revolution. The third agricultural revolution has been called the Green Revolution. This occurred during the 1950s and 1960s, and its main leader was Norman Borlaug, an American agronomist from Iowa. Norman's work was especially influential in impoverished regions around the world, and he is credited with saving close to 1 billion lives. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970. The Green Revolution sounds like it's all about natural farming, but it was the exact opposite. The key strategies in Borlaug's methodology included developing high-yield varieties of cereals, expanding irrigation infrastructure, hybridizing seeds, and the use of synthetic fertilizers. Borlaug's life and accomplishments are told in the book The Wizard and the Prophet, which I read this summer. I highly recommend it. The current state of agriculture is obviously pretty good. Malnourishment and the cost of food are at all-time lows, but there are concerns. Fertilizers cause massive algae blooms, which lead to anoxia, or dead zones created by water losing its dissolved oxygen. The algae doesn't remove the oxygen. Instead, the rapidly multiplying bacteria that consume the dying algae does. Surface water and groundwater in many places around the world is used at a far greater rate than it can be replenished. Some population centers that rely on water to grow food to support them may run out of water, and then they'll either have to leave by the millions or starve. Using groundwater for irrigation also deposits salt onto the soil, and salt makes soil sterile. You can't grow anything, even if you have water, and there's no way to reverse it. Agriculture is one of the major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions as well. These effects are magnified by deforestation, which is caused primarily for agriculture. Here's a weird statistic. We consume almost none of the food we grow. 70% of crops that are grown in the United States are fed to cattle. Only around 1% of the crops grown in fields end up on store shelves. So there's a lot of waste associated with agriculture. Expanding our farmland might not be possible, since we have used almost every square kilometer of usable land on Earth already. A significantly larger world population might require the population at large to become mostly vegetarian. Either that, or say goodbye to the rainforest. Then there's the erosion. Crops planted in rows do a terrible job compared to native grasses at anchoring down soil. 1/3 of cropland loses soil faster than it gains soil. So what will the future of agriculture look like? It's hard to say, but if I had to guess, I would say the next revolution will be indoor agriculture. Growing indoors has huge benefits. You can grow all year round rather than just a few months out of the year. You can also control your water consumption and collect any wasted water. Fertilizers and pesticides are used in far lower quantities as well. You can also grow almost any crop you want. You don't need to rely on the climate outside. This is already happening in some countries that don't really have room to spread out, so they have greatly increased their yields by growing indoors. They can also grow crops that have a much greater value per unit of weight, further maximizing their profits. Or perhaps the next revolution will be a revolution in water. We don't yet have any wide-scale methods for making fresh water from ocean water. We still have so much water beneath our feet that it just isn't necessary to try to make fresh water yet. Maybe we could turn dead land into thriving land. Who knows? That does it for natural resources, soil, and agriculture. Next time, we are going to begin learning about how the wind, water, and ice sculpts Earth's surface and creates its beautiful landscapes. Thanks for watching.